Recently, I was having a discussion about the existence of God with an atheist colleague from university who studies physics. During our discussion, he asked the question whether there is anything science will never be able to explain. He was essentially presenting the so-called God of the gaps objection, which says that if we wait long enough, science will eventually answer all questions which are currently answered by religion. So I decided to make a video about that topic, and in today's video I will summarize and review the book Can Science Explain Everything? It was written in 2019 by Professor John Lennox, who is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. What seems to stop many people from seriously considering the question whether God exists is that they think that science and belief in God are irreconcilable. I'm convinced that it's very important to understand that science and religion can be compatible, because only then it's possible to seriously think about the question whether God exists. And I'm convinced that thinking about this question is of paramount importance. Also, just to be clear, the fact that science can't explain everything does not prove God's existence. But it's necessary to acknowledge that science can't explain everything in order to have a meaningful discussion about God's existence. So even atheists can concede that religion and science are compatible. This view is, for example, held by Alex O'Connor, who is one of the biggest atheist YouTubers and who is a theologically and philosophically very literate person.
Still, I think we're in agreement here that scientific explanations and divine agency can coexist peacefully.
In this video, I will talk about how science and religion, particularly Christianity, are compatible, as they do not compete with each other as explanations of reality. And I will go through common misconceptions about the Christian faith. Professor Lennox starts off by saying that the problem is many people give to all statements by scientists the authority rightly due to science, simply because they are stated by a scientist. For example, he points out when Carl Sagan, an astrophysicist, says that the cosmos is all that there is, or was, or ever will be, this is not a scientific statement, like that gravity obeys an inverse square law, but a statement of atheist belief. The author highlights that smart people can also be very wrong, and he quotes Richard Feynman, a physicist, who said that, "I believe that a scientist looking at non-scientific problems is just as dumb as the next guy. And when he talks about a non-scientific matter, he will sound as naive as anyone untrained in the matter." An example Professor Lennox lists of a scientist being very wrong with a statement outside of the field of expertise is Stephen Hawking, who said that philosophy is dead in his book The Grand Design. The problem the author sees with this statement is that it was made in a book about the philosophy of science. Professor Lennox quotes Albert Einstein, who said that it has often been said, and certainly not without justification, that the man of science is a poor philosopher. Why then should it not be the right thing for the physicist to let the philosopher do the philosophizing? The author also points out that many of the greatest scientists who ever lived were devout Christians, like for example Sir Isaac Newton, who was considered to be an insightful theologian, and he even wrote more about religion than about science. So why did Hawking have a problem with reconciling God and science, but Newton didn't? Professor Lennox explains that the notion that religion and science contradict each other stems from confusion about the nature of God and confusion about the nature of scientific explanation. The author clarifies that while some religions believed in a God of the gaps, this is not the case for Christianity. For example, a God of the gaps would be when people don't understand where thunder comes from, so they say it comes from the God of thunder. In such cases, it is true that this God becomes less relevant the further science progresses. However, this is not the case with Christianity, because as Professor Lennox writes, the God Christians believe in is not a God of the gaps, but a God of the whole show. He's not only a God of the bits we don't understand, but also of the bits we do. What I think might be helpful to understand here is what Christians don't believe in. They don't believe in a man with a beard sitting on a cloud. They also don't say that they don't know where the universe came from, and therefore it was God. The God Christians believe in is the foundation of all of reality, and his existence can be deduced philosophically. So, by asking the question, why is there something rather than nothing, it can be philosophically deduced that there is a foundation of existence, and this foundation is called God. I'm planning to make a video about this philosophical deduction soon, as this topic definitely deserves a video of its own. Now, the second confusion Professor Lennox mentions, apart from the confusion about the nature of God, is confusion about the nature of scientific explanation. He points out that many people think that science and reason are the same thing. But this is not the case, as reason has a far larger scope than science. The scientific explanation is not necessarily the only rational explanation. For example, when asking the question, why is the water boiling? A rational explanation would be that the water is heated in the kettle where it transitions its phase from liquid to gas, etc., etc. But another rational explanation is that the water is boiling because I'm making a cup of tea. These two explanations obviously don't contradict each other, and both are necessary to have a full picture of what's happening. Or, for example, when we have a piece of cake in front of us, science can answer questions about its molecular structure, its temperature, its shape, the chemical and physical processes which needed to happen for this cake. But what science can't answer is why the cake was baked in the first place. The author stresses that science only describes, for example, gravity, but it does not explain it. He quotes the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said that at the basis of the whole modern view of the world lies the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanations of natural phenomena. The modern system makes it appear as though everything were explained. Professor Lennox concludes this chapter by saying that God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with science as an explanation of the motor car. I would also like to mention what Professor Lennox responds to the objection that science allegedly has disproved some biblical claims. For example, he mentions the creation account in Genesis versus Darwin's theory of evolution. The author points out that not everything in the Bible can be interpreted in its literal sense. For example, in John 10:9, Jesus says, "I am the door." It is obvious that we can't interpret that to mean that Jesus is made out of wood. Jesus is the door in the metaphorical sense because through him we can be saved and through him we can enter heaven. So by interpreting Bible passages metaphorically, which are meant to be interpreted metaphorically, there again is no conflict between science and religion. And oftentimes this metaphorical analysis reveals a much deeper meaning, like in the case of Jesus being the door. More about interpreting Genesis is coming soon, by the way. In the next step, Professor Lennox clarifies that nowadays many people have a wrong understanding of what faith is. The word faith is derived from the Latin word fides, which means trust. Usually, we trust someone because we have a reason to trust or evidence to trust that person. He clarifies that not every faith is blind faith. Blind faith means believing without any evidence, and he concedes that this type of faith is dangerous. However, Christianity is an evidence-based faith, as it's based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. As stated in John 20:30-31, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." And also 1 Corinthians 1:15-14, "And if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation has been in vain, and your faith has been in vain." So the only good reason to be a Christian is if Christianity is actually true, and if there are good reasons to believe that Christianity is true. You might object now by saying, what about John 20:29, where it says, "Jesus said to him, 'Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet have come to believe.'" I found Professor Lennox's interpretation of that very insightful. He pointed out that seeing is not the only type of evidence. So while we can't see Jesus anymore, we have other strong reasons to believe that he lived, died, and rose from the dead, like for example, eyewitness accounts. Professor Lennox goes on to explain that faith, as defined before, is not only necessary for religion, but also for science. Just to recapitulate, we've established before that faith in the Christian sense means trust because of evidence. The author argues that in order to be able to do science, it's necessary to be convinced of the fact that science is a suitable means to describe the universe. So it's necessary to have faith in the sense of trusting in the fact that the universe can be described with mathematical equations. This assumption cannot be proven scientifically, but it has to be made in order to be able to do science. He quotes Albert Einstein, who said, "But science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration toward truth and understanding. This source of feeling, however, springs from the sphere of religion. To this, there also belongs the faith in the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational, that is, comprehensible to reason. I cannot conceive of a genuine scientist without that profound faith. The situation may be expressed by an image. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." You might have heard of the article The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences, which was written by the Physics Nobel Prize winner Eugene Wigner. In that article, Wigner writes that it's surprising that the universe can be described in mathematical terms. But scientists believe all the time that nature can be described with mathematics, which enables them to find mathematical descriptions. Another assumption scientists must make in order to be able to do science is the assumption that their reasoning is valid. Let me explain. Professor Lennox recounts that he often asks colleagues what they do science with. They say with their brain. Then he asks them how the brain came about, and they essentially respond that their brain is the result of mindless, unguided processes. Then Professor Lennox likes to ask them if they would trust their computer if he told them that their computer is the result of mindless, unguided processes. And they always say no. He says that he got the idea for this line of reasoning from Darwin himself, who said that, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any conviction in such a mind? Here I'd like to clarify, from my understanding, Professor Lennox does not reject the theory of evolution in his book, but he says that in order to be able to trust in our ability to reason, we have to discard materialism. Materialism is the philosophical position that nothing exists except matter. Now I'd like to read a couple of quotes which are mentioned in the book because I think that they're helpful to understand the problem here. Thomas Nagel is an atheist who said that if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by science. If one doubts that the mental can be reduced to the physical, then there is reason to doubt that reductive materialism can apply even in biology, and also doubt that it can give an adequate account of the physical world. And I'd also like to read two quotes by C.S. Lewis, who was a British writer and lay theologian, who said that unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. And the naturalists have been engaged in thinking about nature. They have not attended to the fact that they were thinking. Finally, I'd like to quote the author of the book himself, who writes, "I reject atheism because I believe Christianity to be true. But I also reject it because I'm a scientist. How could I be impressed with a worldview that undermines the very rationality we need to do science? Science and God mix very well. It is science and atheism that do not mix." Now let's get to my opinion on the book. I really like this book as it gave a very clear overview of the apparent conflict between science and religion, and it showed how this conflict can be resolved. It was actually very difficult for me to summarize the book in about 15 minutes because there were so many things that were worth mentioning. And I'll tell you, the summary you just watched is absolutely stripped to its bone. And whenever a book is difficult to summarize because it contains so much information, that's a great sign, in my opinion, because then it actually makes sense to buy and read the book and not just watch the summary. And this is definitely the case with this book. For example, what I couldn't really fit in the video was what Professor Lennox writes about his personal experience as a scientist who believes in God. For example, he writes that he was told by fellow scientists that if he wanted to become a successful scientist, he had to renounce his belief in God. Now, because the book is about very many topics, it can't go into much detail with each topic. So there were a few arguments which, in my opinion, can and should be explained better. And I've been thinking about the appropriate rating for this book for a while, and I was thinking maybe I should give it a 9.7. But I decided that my rankings shouldn't have smaller steps than 0.5, as this would likely escalate, and I already see myself rating a book a 9.35807 in the future. So while this book wasn't perfect, because there were tiny aspects that could have been elaborated on better, my overall rating is a 10 out of 10, and I highly recommend the book for everyone who wants to gain an understanding of the relationship between religion and science. That's been it for today. I hope you liked the video. See you soon, God bless, and bye!